How old is the Sphinx? This debate has been going back and forth for decades, but there is some new information that kind of categorically can put the carving out of the Sphinx enclosure before the pyramids. So in the traditional timeline, the Sphinx is supposed to be made around the 4th dynasty with Pharaoh Khafra, who they attribute the middle pyramid. It's Khufu who did the Great Pyramid, and then Khafra who did the middle pyramid, and he's supposed to be that dude there, if you believe in the traditional timeline. Now, lots of people have been looking at the erosion that is around the Sphinx enclosure and saying, hey, that erosion looks like it was a lot older than, we all know that story. I'm not relaying the water erosion story. I'm relaying new information. Okay. Just so we can all see what we're talking about, this is a photo I took of one of the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, and you can see there is like big fissures and lots of erosion pattern. However, there are technically like at least three different types of erosion that is all going on in the same time. That's why it's a bit more complex than it's just wind erosion or it's just water erosion. All three are there. You have wind erosion, you have water erosion, and you also have like groundwater sucky up erosion, where the groundwater gets sucked up into the limestone, and then the hot and cold from day to night, the salt basically like crystallizes, evaporates, and it like cracks off bits of rock. So it's very, very flaky rock. However, we cannot just disregard the whole water erosion theory, because the west end, like the butt end of the Sphinx enclosure, has much more erosion than the east end. It literally increases as you walk towards the back of the Sphinx. Now, why this is interesting is because if the water erosion was only coming up from the groundwater, then this doesn't make sense, because the east side, the front of the Sphinx, is actually closer to the natural water table, and the east side is where you would have had the original Nile meeting the dockyard at the front of the Sphinx. So it doesn't make sense that there's more water erosion at the back than there is at the front. So the water must have come from another source, from the air, rather than from the ground. That's what this study's saying. And you can clearly see it with your eyeballs. This is the front end of the Sphinx, where the erosion is like not that bad, and this is the back end of the Sphinx, where it's like really bad. There's like lots of water had been falling here. You can also find evidence for erosion channels in the floor of the enclosure, which means that the rainwater was falling down the back, off the Giza Plateau, into the Sphinx enclosure, and heading down towards the Nile along the floor. So indisputable evidence for water erosion. However, we are not using the water erosion damage to date this new information. We are using the quarry behind. This is the Sphinx, and there is a quarry known as the Khafra quarry. So this is where supposedly the limestone was quarried out to build the pyramids, right? Now, this obviously caused it's a quarry. It causes a big, huge dip in the land just before the Sphinx. This is really, really, really important. This is a little diagram here about the topography of the Giza Plateau without a quarry, okay? This is how rainwater would come down and flash flood across the quarry. It would flash flood across the Giza Plateau, which is on a slope. It's higher at the top near the pyramids and comes down to where the Sphinx is. And this topography matches exactly the water erosion that is found in and around the Sphinx enclosure, that it's way worse at the back and it gets lighter as it's coming around the side. Anyway, so this is how water would have flowed. However, it could have only flowed in this pattern if the quarry wasn't there. So therefore, the Sphinx enclosure and the Sphinx was quarried out before the pyramid quarry that was behind it, because now and since the quarry was made, any water flow across the Giza Plateau, which has been demonstrated in subsequent historical flash floods, the water gets collected in the quarry and kind of forms like a lake, and it does not enter the enclosure. It gets stuck in the quarry, and the topography goes off. It doesn't work anymore. So there we are. So now there's really good evidence and a really good argument that the Sphinx enclosure and potentially the original version of the Sphinx itself, we all know that the head was cut later, that's fine. But the original body and the original enclosure was cut pre-pyramid. Now, depending on where you stand on when the pyramids were built, that's how you can kind of arrange the dating order of the Sphinx to the pyramid. So, we could get conservatively, we could say that this was cut out a few hundred years before the pyramids, and therefore it wasn't Khafre who made this, but maybe repurposed it. Or if you're pushing your timeline of when the pyramids were made back, this still has to have been made first. So we're getting closer and closer to finding out when the Sphinx was carved. Now, this made me have a thought, because we know that the Sphinx temple, the Valley Temple, which was now in front of the Sphinx, I was told that the temple was built out of the enclosure limestone. So when they cut out the Sphinx enclosure, they repurposed the quarried rock, and then they built the temple exactly in front of it. However, if we now know that the enclosure was built before the pyramid quarry was, that means that these temples must be older too. So which makes sense, because they look hella old. They are crazy eroded. And we also need to keep in mind that these are like the inner core of the cake. It would have had icing. It would have had beautiful granite slabs encasing it for thousands of years. So the erosion that has happened on the innermost cake of the temple is also pretty old. So we have to keep sliding everything up in order that we find it. So if we know that this rock here was the rock that was carved out of the Sphinx enclosure, and if we know the Sphinx enclosure was carved before the quarry behind to make the pyramid behind, then this temple's hella old. Sorry, I should have used this photo. You can see way more of the erosion that's happening there. Sorry, Matt, I should have done this first. Shout out to Ancient Architects YouTube channel, because Matt has done a really good in-depth long video all about the topography of around the Sphinx and the quarries and the dating. So make sure you check out Ancient Architects. Ancient Architects. Jeez. He's your guy for some really good sources. Okay, there we are. Happy hunting.